Early in the book that we're here to discuss today, Alessandra Gribaldo writes, quote, "It is sufficiently clear what women are asking for in their daily life, a life without violence," end quote. It is also sufficiently clear that women around the world are not getting this. Intimate partner violence against women is a long-standing global problem, which recent pandemic lockdowns made even worse. Domestic spaces are often seen as a refuge in a cruel world, and yet legions of women are unsafe in them. When women are unsafe in the refuge, they readily become insecure everywhere. In addition to physical violence against women, there is the threat of violence, which is a clear mode of coercing women into attention and response to men in order to fend off physical violence. And this does nothing to alleviate the psychological violence that forms much of the damage that Professor Gribaldo analyzes in her book. The threat of violence lies behind much, if not most, sexual harassment, which Me Too and related movements have again reminded us is a universal experience for women. Education does not seem to reduce sexual harassment in itself. A recent study found that half of all women in construction, retail, and hospitality in Australia report being sexually harassed. But so did 80% of women in the university-fed sector of media and communication and telecommunications. Now, one logical resource for threats ranging from workplace harassment to intimate partner violence is the law, which brings us back to Professor Gribaldo's remarkable ethnography of the Italian court system's treatment of such cases. She finds that the law shows, quote, "many reluctances and failures, much embarrassment and difficulty in making domestic violence an appropriate object of judgment," end quote. Her book is a study of what we might call the inner life of the law, as well as of the women who bring cases before it. After immersing herself in the worlds of nearly all the parties involved in prosecuting these cases, Professor Gribaldo comes to see the multiplicity of stories that emerge from women's experience of it as a resource, rather than simply as a problem for legal truth as such. Post-structuralist and critical theory are very, very good at identifying impasses and contradictions in discourse, including that of the law and of applications of the law for the intended benefit of its victims. It turns out that when Anthropology, Professor Gribaldo's version, does empirical investigation of the law's effects, critical theory is right. And with Professor Gribaldo, interestingly, this is good news rather than bad. Okay, a word about context. This is the ISRF's 9th launch of books written by our fellows. They are distinctively pluridisciplinary, by which I mean they get at underlying structures treated by fields like psychology or critical theory that are sometimes missed or separated off by the orthodox social sciences. These overlooked structures often involve what Professor Gribaldo calls inner difficulty. Since we started our series last November, we've launched 3 books on the failure of democracies actually to democratize their societies. Annalyn Dadang's History of Freedom, Oche Onazi on Ubuntu as an African path towards disability justice, and Kimberly Brownlee on the philosophical priority of social rights to individual rights. We've also launched 3 books on the failure of prominent efforts to suppress war, Cian O'Driscoll on the failings of just war theory, Craig Jones on the war lawyering that makes continuous war more, not less likely in the American and Israeli armed forces. And in the first of 3 July launches of books on multiple types of violence, we discussed at the beginning of this month, Catherine Charrette's research on why the European Union failed to recognize Hamas after their 2006 election victory in Gaza. We've also launched 2 books on how mainstream economics damages both society and the planet as it operates in anti-democratic modes controlled by special or specific interests. There was Gabor Shearing's book on Hungarian leader Viktor Orban's creation of an authoritarian accumulative state. And in June, Peter Newell's book on how to break the grip of the fossil fuel complex over energy policy. Okay, within this group, Doctors Onazi, Brownlee, and Charrette focused as much on intersubjective psychology as on politics and the law, or saw these dimensions as completely interconnected. For example, Dr. Charette saw the last 15 years of Israel-Palestine conflict flowing in part from European diplomats failing to act on their individual desires, which were generally to recognize Hamas, rather than refusing it the diplomatic status that they actually ended up refusing it. So Professor Gribaldo unearths a similar type of hesitation in the women before the law and in the law itself, and looking at what she calls the inner difficulty. And she notes that towards the end of her book, hesitation, I'm quoting again, entails a pause that in turn allows for taking a stance, end quote. So in moments of pessimism, I sometimes wonder whether a life without violence for women requires leaving modernity itself. And Professor Gribaldo has found some subtle means and mechanisms that, even within our current structures, may allow women to get closer to a dissipation of this shadow that hangs over their lives. Okay, so as Lars mentioned, we'll start with Professor Gribaldo's overview of her book, which will run 10 or 15 minutes or so. And then we'll proceed with our commentators, Dr. Andrea Garcia Gonzalez, coming to us from Brighton, England, and then from Andrea Müllerbach, coming from Berlin, each of them speaking in theory for 5 to 8 minutes, although I think they're going to go over today. Dr. Gribaldo may want to reply, and then we'll open it up for your questions. And I'll introduce each of our guests one at a time. Okay, so first, Alessandra Gribaldo is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Roma Tre. In addition to working on today's subject, she also studies reproductive technologies, ethnographic theory, contemporary Italy, and migration. She's the author of many books and articles in Italian, so I feel like a lot of her contributions is submerged for those of us who don't read it, including a book on the production of gender and another on artificial reproduction that should be translated into English as something like, like Nature Decomposed. She has recently edited in English Boundaries Within, Nation, Kinship, and Identity Among Migrants and Minorities. Alessandra, let me turn it over to you and just say welcome, and it's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris, for this nice introduction, and also Stuart and Lars for organizing the event, and of course, Andrea Garcia Gonzalez and Andrea Müllerbach, who have accepted to participate to this presentation and spend some time with us. I would like to thank as well Louise Braddock, previous Director of Research of the Foundation, for her suggestions, and more generally, the Foundation for giving me the chance to write the book when I was not in the academy and no other financial support was available, and of course, the editorial collective of How Books for Publishing. The project of this book has roots in the contrast I found during my research between, on the one hand, something that had the feature of the already known, widespread, common, that is domestic violence, and on the other hand, the enormous difficulties and contradiction that emerge when the law deals with it. The ethnographic perspective gave me the chance to use Italy as an indicative case and try to explore and delve into these contradictions. And of course, not trying to solve them, but to let them talk some way. And speaking in legal terms has historically a decisive, effective, and symbolic value in the definition of victimhood. Moving into an institutional dimension is perceived as a sort of milestone that acknowledges that violence has been perpetrated, that the testimony of this violence is truthful, and that women are political subjects. So the woman who speaks out is finally not alone. Speaking in public means, or should mean, that her voice is going to join other voices, other words to compose a chorus. The collective voice is what feminism is made of. At the same time, the pressure on the victim of domestic violence to speak about the factual events, about herself and her relationship with the perpetrator, and to denounce him before the law has vast implications. Perpetrators can, of course, violently enforce women's silence, but the professional language of victimhood can also operate elisions in the construction of a victim subject. And intimacy involved in domestic violence does not lend itself to the consistency required by the law, and it's something that has to do with women's situation, choices, and feelings. And judges as well are implicated in what is perceived as a known dimension of the private life. The complexity of expectations makes the dynamics in court odd, as judges have difficulties in managing women's narratives, ending up in asking personal questions like, did you still love him? And women who testify about their own experience are caught into a sort of spiral of partially contradictory narratives through which they appear less and less reliable. In a context where documentary evidence is often not available, women's testimonies play an essential role in the absence of documentation from emergency room visits or statements from witnesses. Evidence is in fact often based exclusively on the testimony of the victim. And this is the main means of establishing proof. It may represent the only element upon which a judgment is based, provided the testimony has achieved a suitable degree of validity. More than often, the woman's testimony does not attempt to meet the judge's request. It does not lend itself to formalization and is continuously caught up with experiential and contingent elements. And the victim position in the trial can appear ambiguous. Victims of domestic violence are considered often too difficult or largely uncooperative. For different reasons, which are related to economic, practical, and sentimental issues, a woman may decide not to proceed or may end up having second thoughts and dropping the charges. But the mandatory prosecution rule means that she might be called on to participate in the trial against her will. Testifying to domestic violence entails the risk of being marginalized, judged excessive, seen as plain victim, and thought of as manipulative. Women do not speak too little or too much. Their testimonies are paradoxically in the very constitution, characterized by an inadequate and contradictory structure. The judgment of law entails that violence within the family has to be made clear and comprehensible in order to be assessed. Therefore, it is necessary to understand what kind of violence it is, which are the reasons behind it, what is the context. In the book, I've tried to highlight how this interpretive label on gender violence is required from the one who suffered violence and not from the perpetrator. This explanation has to be provided by the victim, as she is the one who best embodies the effort to interpret otherwise meaningless violence, as the perpetrator doesn't attest any claim about its meaning. So women have to say it all about violence and about the relationship with the perpetrator to perform the meaning of pressing charges, namely a request for judgment. So the book addresses the following questions. How can violence in intimate relationships be made present to institutions? How is the abused subject constituted in front of them? What requirements relate to women's ability to identify and denounce the violent act? And beyond the acknowledged hardship that women who press charges are confronted with, is there an inner difficulty that lies in the status of testimonial proof when gender, intimacy, and violence are at stake? I have focused on women's practices of resistance, on silences, on testimonies in court in this process of elicitation of intelligible subjectivities. And I have advanced some reflections on questions of evidence, persuasion, and testimony, and their implications for ethnographic and feminist theory. In particular, I'm interested in the problematic encounter among the necessity to speak, the entanglement of violence and intimacy, and the subjectivity implied. Diverse ways of articulating experience are required from women in different professional fields, such as social services, law enforcement, and the justice system. And this way to include speaking the facts, given the reasons, telling the truth, talking about oneself, taking a clear stance, claiming one's right, and pressing charges. This collection of different modalities of bearing witness is what I've called speaking violence. So as to capture both the topic of what is spoken and the performative violence of the request for narration in an institutional context. I've proposed a twofold strategy to address these questions. First, rather than asking what abused women want from the law, it may be more productive to understand what the law wants from women. And second, it would be more constructive maybe to consider the relationship between professionals and victims of violence as an encounter between two hesitations. Even if it's clear what women are asking for in the daily life, a life without violence, the relationship with law is in addressing institution and the response by the justice system emerge as exceptionally opaque. And this opacity comes from the problematic relationship between the demonstration of violence, intimacy, and gender. So if women hesitate before the law, the justice system, for its part, shows as many reluctances and failures, as much embarrassment and difficulty in making domestic violence an appropriate object of judgment. And the liberal subject of law draws on a humanism that conceals its class, gender, racial, and sexual norms. Feminist reflections have the capacity to re-establishing boundaries, terms, and idioms, striving to recognize unvoiced and unspeakable subjects. At the same time, the effort of feminist thought is to eschew the risk of falling into essentially traps that identify women as a subaltern, monolithic subject, a subject who occupies a position of complete exteriority in relation to the law. And so law is by definition haunted by issues and subjects that cannot be taken into account. Feminist thought on law not only considers the constraints that impede women's access to a state of individual autonomy, it also calls into question the features of the concept of autonomy as they have become consolidated in liberal thought and its applications. The dimension of gender is a critical element that casts into doubt the universalist pretensions of the conventional legal sub. So in the face of the request by the law to embody the victim subject figure actually impossible to perform straightforwardly, we may wonder, following Laurent Berglund, the brilliant cultural theorist who recently passed away, is it thinkable to refuse the juropolitics of effect by demanding different ways of telling the truth, ways that do not conform to the requirements of authenticity? Are ambiguities and complexities always disastrous in the legal system? To take intimate partner violence into account through an ethnographic and anthropological approach allows us to place it within a broader debate on gender and gendered subjectivity, power, and agency. And an ethnographic analysis on the dynamics that produce the subjectivity of the victim in the institutional context may shed light not only on the ways in which the Italian legal system essentially reproduces the conditions of violence against women, the secondary victimization, but also on the conundrums that make women unexpected subject for the law. In some cases, the required modes of testimony during the hearings I had the chance to observe were disrupted by women through the informal use of communication styles drawn from popular culture, producing a kind of eccentric response to the court's demands. And speaking the truth, true power, as the motto goes, is a risky exercise that disrupts assumptions and raises embarrassing questions. So to conclude, in this frame, feminism, I believe, acts not as a solution, but as a productive constraint, we may say. It creates zones of uncertainty, of struggle, and a refusal of the status quo, sometimes, where differences can be contested. So my wish is to connect feminist issues, especially the long debated disavowal of women's words, with questions that anthropology is good at answering and possibly to pose new ones. And I stop here and I'll wait for your comments.
That was too short. So we'll come back to you in your response later. It's really interesting. Thanks a lot. Okay, our first response is coming from Andrea Garcia Gonzalez. She is currently an ESRC-funded postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Brighton. She's conducted research in both the Basque Country and Northern Ireland on a key research interest, which is informing policy to build post-conflict societies that eschew violence. Her doctoral work focuses on understanding the gender dimensions of reconciliation as a concept and practice, and she takes a feminist approach to the post-ceasefire process in both regions. Her ESRC project is called Social Policy in Conflict-Affected Contexts, a Feminist Approach to Violence and Peace in the Basque Country. Andrea, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much to you, Chris, and to Lars for inviting me here. I have to say that in this final push before taking my annual leave, the reading of this book has been a proper boost. And thank you, Alessandra, for this motivation. The book resonates a lot, not just with my current academic research, but also connects deeply with my work as a practitioner on gender-based violence prevention that I carry out before being in the academia, and also connects with personal experiences navigating patriarchal violence of the everyday. This book makes a significant contribution to the fields of anthropology of law, anthropology of state, feminist anthropology, and to peace and conflict studies. And moreover, this book goes beyond the academic field, and it will be of good use for opening dialogues with those working on gender-based violence. And I appreciate that a lot and how accessible it is. This book is an extraordinary example of an ethnography that, as such, brings the reader to a specific context in order to understand a much broader phenomenon. In its compelling writing, Gribaldo makes us, the readers, become part of the trials that she attends. And I have to say that my copy of the book, I can show proof of it, you cannot see, but it's full of exclamations and statements like, oh, this is outrageous, when listening through the words put there by Alessandra, how the trials were ongoing and the violence being committed against, like, one layer of violence more on the victims of already victims of violence. Through this ethnography, the legal system is revealed as intrinsically violent towards women. And I think one of the roles of anthropology is precisely putting into question the violence that is normalized. You just have to tell us what happened. This statement appears at the beginning of the second chapter of the book. It is a statement directed towards one of these women in court. And despite the innocent appearance of this statement, it represents the violence of the legal system that Gribaldo explores in the book. First, it connects with the obligation to speak violence and relates to the assumption that this narrative of violence has no constraints. Gribaldo shows along the book, and also in her sharp criticism of the notion of free consent, how historical and social dynamics are dismissed in the legal approach to statements raised by victims of gender-based violence. Power dynamics that influence women's expressions are ignored under the neoliberal figure of the free individual. Power dynamics are not only ignored, but also reenacted during the trials. Secondly, the statement, "you just have to tell us what happened," bring us to the courtroom where the victim is placed at the center of the trial. We may think that this is what justice should mean, listening to the person who now can raise her voice to reveal the injustice she has suffered. However, in the book, we could observe that listening becomes judging, that the trial hinges upon the scrutiny of the life of that woman, of her own self, judging her decisions, judging her emotions. If her testimony is the only evidence, as it happens to be, then the investigation revolves around her intimacy. The verdict depends on her performance in court. She needs to perform the image of a victim that can be trusted. And as Alessandra was saying in her presentation, that performance is almost an impossible role to reach, full of contradictory expectations. Play the innocent victims, but not too innocent in case the judge perceives her as trying to manipulate the verdict. Play the role without raising suspicion about knowing how to play the role. Thirdly, tell us what happened also appears as an invitation to trust the system. One of the questions that Gribaldo raises in the book is how useful trials are. There is no clear answer to this uncomfortable question. This is the value of ethnography, shattering preconceptions, ideas, arguments that we may take for granted. And this is the value of feminist ethnography, to express ambivalences and contradictions far from the masculine gaze of the scientific observer that tries to perpetuate an illusion of coherence, control, and closure. The patriarchal gaze that establishes what counts as rational, as knowledge, as truth. Following the work of feminist scholars, I understand the goal of this book to reveal the violence intrinsic to these institutional devices as part of the commitment of feminist research to paying attention to systems of structure and structures of violence, as opposed to only examining individual physical acts of it. Ethnography can reveal violence and can also bring ambivalences and hesitations that are not permitted by patriarchal systems of knowledge and power. In trials, women need to narrate coherent stories to be trusted. Ambivalences seem to be punished. They need to surrender to the constraints posed over their feelings and expressions. In this sense, the exploration of the legal system is part of the examination and criticism of patriarchal systems of knowledge and power. The demand for persuasive testimonies to adopt specific forms of narrative is part of the dominant construction of the knower, of the configuration of what subject is considered knowledgeable enough to be taken into consideration. The book goes in line with criticism raised by feminist scholars that since the 80s have challenged these patriarchal ways of knowing and have opened epistemic possibilities to thinking otherwise. Donna Haraway, in her seminal essay, Situated Knowledges, advocated for a science of stuttering, of non-closure, being contestable and contested, coming from the body, from the view of a body which is complex, contradictory, and contrary to the view from nowhere, from the claimed neutral scientist. Recently, explorations on politics and pedagogies of discomfort have also stressed the importance of ambiguity as an openness to understanding the world and to acting transformatively. I find connections between the anthropology of hesitation that Gribaldo advocates for and feminist scholars that are suggesting examining discomfort as a way to locate and transcend violence. April Petillo, for instance, opened the first issue of Feminist Anthropology journal last year, exploring discomfort in a reflection on the violence embedded in the academia. She raises the concept of academic affect to understand what Gribaldo refers as the politics of truth-telling. For Petillo, vocal cues, language choices, physical stances, measured emotions are part of the performance sanctioned in the academic realm for certain bodies to be regarded as capable knowledge producers. In a parallel setting, the site of the court, we could call testimonial affect, maybe, to analyze, as Gribaldo does, the ways to perform victimhood for the subject to be seen as eliciting the truth. And this relates to what Alessandra has just explained about the perspective of Lauren Berglund about affect and how that's part of her book. You just have to tell us what happened. This statement ignores the difficulty to name normalized structural violence. In relation to this difficulty of naming violence, I connect here with research carried out in so-called post-conflict contexts. In my own research, when interviewing women who have suffered the violence of the vast conflict, violence was expressed through metonymical figures on many occasions. In addition, many of the women that I interviewed did not consider their experiences of violence important enough to be narrated, as these experiences did not fit in the category of the, in capital letters, the violence being discussed in the public domain in the performance of memory. Fiona Ross, in her analysis of public hearings in the South African Truth Commission, affirms that narratives of women were elliptical, using repetition, metaphors, gesture, and silence. Also, in her analysis of the construction of victimhood in Colombia, Roxani Cristalli states that bodies remember and recount violence messily and out of order. In the courtrooms in Gribaldo's book, the legal system demands a shared interpretation between the plaintiff and those judging her. The messiness of remembrance, the erasure of painful memories, the incoherence in narrating violence that has been analyzed by feminist scholars does not have a room in the court testimonial. Another highlight in the book that Alessandra has explained in her presentation relates to the fact that this interpretative labor of violence is the mandate of the powerless, not the powerful. So as Gribaldo states in her book, she is the responsible for not having avoided the violence. So after these reflections, I'm going to finish with some questions for the discussion. First, I would like to raise or to reflect about the terms that Gribaldo uses to refer to gender-based violence, which are intimate partner violence and domestic violence. You use them interchangeably, and I wonder how you made the decision of using these terms. And I wonder in this, because for me, it was surprising when I came to English-speaking countries, I noticed that references to violence against women were framed under the term domestic violence mainly. And this term has found broad criticism in Spain, where I used to work, and we actually never use it, since we consider that it confines violence into a specific setting and erases the power dynamics that the concept of gender implies. So we normally use gender-based violence as a term, or violence against women, or feminicide in some occasions. And my second question relates to the methodology used. The narratives of women survivors of violence in the book come from the courtroom and from the interviews to women who were living in a shelter. On the one hand, I wonder how you navigated the question of interviews as potentially re-traumatizing the interviewee, since this is something that I think many of us working on violence constantly deal with. Some colleagues have even decided not to carry out interviews, but using what has been already recorded. I can see the point in your research of conducting interviews as a way to reflect on how women speak about violence and how those ways of expression are not tolerated in court. I also understand the point of selecting women that are in a shelter, since they are the ones going to court and have a long trajectory of facing the violence of the legal system. This methodology leads to the important conclusion that what is relevant to those who suffer violence does not necessarily correspond with what is relevant for the penal system. I also had the concern about the risk of placing the focus on the extreme violence that these women in the shelter have suffered. My concern is that focusing on this extreme violence could prevent further awareness of the multiple forms that violence takes in the everyday. However, I believe that in your book, as you go through the nuances of the testimonies, you also reveal the slow violence that is experienced by these women. And that is precisely the institutions, those that fail to address the multiple forms of violence. In this sense, for further research to come, I wonder as well, how do you think that all these nuances of violence can further be studied and written about? How can we narrate violence in a way that it does not seem far away from our experience, but can allow us women to identify it and for perpetrators also to recognize it? How to carry out research that explores the complexity of everyday violence in relations of intimacy. Lately, I see that in popular culture, we are watching some ways to tell stories that convey complexities and nuances of violence, such as in the acclaimed TV show, I May Destroy You. So if ethnography is about telling stories, may we draw some inspiration from these other ways of representation? I wonder. And I was also very curious about two ideas in your books, two central ideas. Your concept of an anthropology of hesitation that I think you have explained during your presentation, and related to that, this idea of the unexpected as a disruption in the violence of the patriarchal system that connects with the title of your book. So yeah, if you want to expand in some of the points, I will be happy to be part of the discussion later. Thank you.
Next, we're going to have one more comment, Tate. Then we'll go back to Alessandra, and then we'll open up for questions. There's already a question in Q&A, and I encourage you to put them in there as they occur to you. We are usually very successful getting to all of them before we stop. Okay, Andrea Mullerbach was Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Toronto until a few days ago. She is starting a new position at the University of Bremen in Germany. Her first book is called The Moral Neoliberal Welfare and Citizenship in Italy, which came out with the University of Chicago Press in 2012. This book explored the privatization of social welfare in northern Italy as a case of what she calls neoliberalism's moral authoritarianism. Her second book tracks the politics of water privatization, financialization, and re-municipalization in austerity-era Europe, with a special interest in new forms of political imagination and environmental citizenship. Her publications include a co-edited collection called Post-Fordist Affect, and a recent piece on poverty and race in Italy in a collection called Messy Europe, Crisis and Whiteness in Post-Colonial Europe. Andrea, many thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be included in this discussion. Thank you for having me, Alessandra Gribaldo and Christopher Newfield. Thank you also to Lars and Stuart for putting together the event. I'd like to begin by commending Professor Gribaldo for this important book. As we read through its pages, it's quite obvious that it emerged out of lengthy fieldwork that must have been often quite draining and emotionally complex and difficult. And I just wanted to acknowledge that work that Alessandra did here. The book excels in drawing us into the complexity of what it means to speak about gender-based abuse and violence from within the scene of intimacy, the familial home, and to do so before a court of law. This is a form of intimate violence, familial violence, or what in Italy is called maltrattamento in famiglia, that the victims of violence must speak and articulate within the court through the act of testimony. So Unexpected Subjects offers us an ethnography of what happens at the cusp or at the threshold of what one might call an affective scene that is entangled with and generated out of quite literally unspeakable violence on the one hand, into the realm of the legal, the political, and the public within the court of law. This problem of translation at the threshold, at this particular threshold between the so-called private sphere and the public sphere, is particularly pronounced in courts that operate according to the Roman law tradition, as Gribaldo argues, towards the end of the book, which, unlike common law traditions, hinges more explicitly on testimony and avowal, and on the judgment of the person as such. The courts of law described by Gribaldo are the stage for what, ideally at least, are supposedly clarifying roles of testimonies. Testimonies that ideally produce the battered woman as sort of an active, self-aware and political subject who's able to articulate herself through clear wording, a sense of chronology and duration of violence, and commitment and capacity to visibility and publicity that leaves behind the secrecy and invisibility of familial violence. What we get instead of dichotomies between truth versus falsehood and evidence versus obfuscation, clarity versus illegibility, is a much more complex situation where truths are indeterminate, misremembered, retracted, or even unspeakable, and where language is marked by hesitation, reluctance, obfuscation, and embarrassment, failure and evasiveness, what Gribaldo towards the end calls truth lying. Often too, the evidence women are supposed to provide in court is maddeningly general, refuses to offer details, and full of derailments. But the opposite problem exists too. Testimonies that are too detailed can also work against the woman, since she might come across as manipulative, as self-interested, especially if she asks for damages. The appearance of the successful victim is crucial to the success of the trial. What is needed is a subject before the law that is, quote, subjugated, passive, and aware at the same time, unquote. The speaking subject that is supposed to inhabit the clear boundary between the hidden intimacy and privacy of familial violence and the truth set out in the courtroom cannot deliver these intractable truths and are often, in fact, frustrated and sort of a source of disappointment for prosecutors. The woman walks a tightrope where the legibility of her claims are tested and read by a court of law that already presumes women to be incapable of presenting their inner truths transparently. Her interiority must thus be discerned and laid out, not primarily by her, but by the ultimate arbitrator, the judge. Gribaldo carefully dissects this question and makes the argument, one of many, that it is precisely the fact that intimate partner violence that makes it so difficult to articulate and disambiguate, say, from early attraction or love. As Gribaldo argues, violence is the dark side of intimacy, a very Lauren Berlantian reading of intimacy as something that is or can as much be entangled with familiarity and comfort as it is connected to unavoidable troubles. As Berglund put it, there are unavoidable troubles, the distractions, disruptions that make things turn out to be unpredictable scenarios. Romance and friendship inevitably meet the instabilities of sexuality, money, expectation, and exhaustion, producing at the extreme moral dramas of estrangement and betrayal, along with terrible spectacles of neglect and violence, even when desire perhaps endures. How then does one clearly articulate and talk about bodily harm and violence if intimacy / violence can be so maddeningly entangled? And how does one do so in a court of law? This is what Gribaldo's book is about, and she fascinatingly unearths the way in which the undertaking of translating violent experience into words is fraught with multiple contradictions, some of which I'd like to highlight here also because they might really be extremely important also for practitioners working in this field. So first, and there's many, and I'm just pulling out a few, Gribaldo shows how courts of law hinge on forms of evidence that demand concise descriptions of repeated forms of aggression and violence, all of which need to be described in detail and in their temporal, that is to say, repeated character. I found in contrast that many of the abused women in court spoke in highly generic temporal narratives, such as he's always acted like that, he's always treated me badly, as if the general atmospherics of violence they're trying to escape does not allow for precisely the kind of evidentiary language, concise, attuned to the staccato of violent events and its chronicity that courts demand. Battered women, she shows, often cannot speak the language of evidence. Gribaldo also found that courts cannot understand the language of trauma, insofar as trauma hinges on dissociation, forgetting, repression, and misremembering. The narrative, Gribaldo writes, is blocked by the unconscious. She's here citing another author whose name I didn't write down here, but while Gribaldo warns against the overusage of the clinical language of trauma, she still insists that the particular relationship that battered women have to experience a narrative should be analyzed through that lens. If trauma produces a crisis of representation, then the language of trauma cannot, at least not yet, be understood or translated into sense by the law. Gribaldo further shows that lawyers focused on physical abuse, i.e. the material evidence most effective within the judicial system. However, it's a problem that many of the women interviewed by Gribaldo focus not on physical violence, but on emotional violence, and most importantly, on having lived with an atmospherics of constant threat and constant potential violence. What then is violence, or what is the worst form of violence, is also a question that remains unresolved within the courts. Paradoxically, Gribaldo further argues the most authentic testimony is one that is, quote, close to silence. Quote, it's the relationship between speech and silence that produces the evidence of wounded intimacy. painting the picture of an interior world that is worthy. Here's another contradiction that victims have to maneuver around: how to speak about violence if the most legitimate speech act or performance of victimhood within the court is one that is mostly silent. So in sum, I think this book is an incredibly important intervention into the fact that there exists a maddening prevalence of violence against women all over the globe. And at the same time, we have this frustrating inability on the part of social science to fully understand it. Intimate partner violence, as Gribaldo argues, exists in excess and as a remainder in the social sciences. This book is an extremely important corrective, I think, to this paucity and blind spot. And I actually had exactly the same question. Now I'm going to my question that Andrea had, which is a methodological one. If there is such a paucity of studies, I would love for Alessandra to reflect a little bit on the methodology and what methodological advice you might have for social scientists wishing to study this phenomenon further. This is obviously an extremely sensitive topic. The fieldwork is hard, draining. And there's also the danger, as Andrea already mentioned, of re-traumatization. I'm sure there's many people in the room who'd love to hear about this. And the other question, I'll just say one more that I had here, was that I just find it so fascinating and striking to imagine this scene in Italian courtrooms where the accused speaks through the defense. So his words are actually never really heard. But the woman, the victim, is constantly being interrogated, and this scene of speech versus utter silence on the part of the perpetrator of violence is very striking to me. You draw the genealogy to Roman law and the prevalence and place of testimony in Roman law, and in contrast to common law traditions. And I just was wondering whether you could place this very extraordinary scene of profound imbalance within the Italian court system within a more global perspective. Is this a very unusual scene when it comes to the way in which testimonial and speech is organized in court cases surrounding or dedicated to gender-based violence? Or is this just a particular articulation of what happens in some ways, across the board, where really the person interrogated is always already the woman rather than the perpetrator? And in Italy, it's just a particularly strong articulation of this case. I'd like to get a better sense of the distinction between different legal systems, and I guess how then sort of the scene of speech and language then emerges in the court case because of these different legal traditions. Those are my first two questions, but thank you again very much for this, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for this very generous feedback and comments. And okay, we start with Andrea Garcia Gonzalez comments. And thank you, Andrea, for highlighting this peculiar issue, the fact that women have to just tell what has happened. So it's trivial some way, just tell what has happened, what happened. And I believe that this is the focus of the issue, because that there is this sort of individual, singular individual, which is taken for granted, no? The liberal individual who has simply talk about an experience. So that's why I've tried in the book to get a little bit into this idea of experience. So the other question is, what did you experience? So what's your own experience of violence? And so all this interpretation that goes on, and the more they investigate and the more the women become, and the less the women become trustworthy. And yes, the two questions, the three questions that you made. Yes, the idea of domestic violence, the language we use. So domestic violence or gender-based violence or intimate partner violence, battered woman, and that's it, and violence against women. So I really I've wondered what kind of definition and language was better to use. And I've decided to use intimate partner violence because I thought that the issue of intimacy, it seems to me the most complicated issue to address in this all articulated scenario. And at the same time, I've used, you're right, I've used domestic violence sometimes because I wanted to address as well this idea of something which is very common. And when in Italian we speak about violence against women, domestic violence, violenza domestica, is the term that we always use, even if we all know that it's often not domestic, and the fact to focus on the domestic context misses the point some way, as you've highlighted. And yes, of course, we had some discussion when I was talking to the other people involved in this research, because I've conducted my research, but it was based on a larger equipe, and we've been discussing we discussed about that, how to what kind of language to use. And yes, regarding methodology, rightly you underline that is it meaningful? Is it necessary to focus so much on women's narratives, interviews, and what happens during hearings and so on? And isn't it better to, or a new chance to find a way to make this problem broader? So to enlarge the gaze and try to understand a little bit better what is structural violence. And of course, I think this is very important. And I had some trouble at the beginning because when I had these interviews and sometimes they lasted for hours, and it was very, very, sort of confidential moment. And I was struck at the end of these interviews when women, they said, okay, it's been nice to talk to you, but now I hope not to see you again ever. And this is not flattering for anthropologists, of course, but this is it. I just told you something, but I don't want to think about that. I don't want to identify with that. And this is because, as you rightly underline, it's a piece. It's one side of the violence, but violence is something which is much wider. And so yes, maybe we should focus on the way, in a way, to tackle structural violence. And this is, of course, a huge issue, and I would like to try to focus more on in further research to understand much better this relationship between domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and structural violence. And the fact that you have mentioned this TV series, I May Destroy You, and I must confess I haven't watched it yet, but a lot of friends have told me that I have to, and have some trouble in watching movies about violence against women, but I'm going to do it. And yes, the fact that we should some way tackle and approach the everyday violence, I think that's the main question. The everyday is not just something that has to do with your partner, not something that has to do with the specific situation, but it's something which is structural. And is repeated on and on in every single moment of your life. And yes, regarding hesitations, this, I mean, I just wanted to understand a little bit better what intimate partner violence means and for the law and for the people involved in the process of contrasting violence. And so I've really seen this sort of difficulty and hesitation, because sometimes you realize that there's a sort of what can I say? Even when I had interviews with judges that normally are so self-confident, they hesitated regarding this specific subject, because they said, okay, we must say that we have not all the proper instrument to tackle with that. And so it was interesting for me to see this sort of encounter between two hesitations. And yes, it's something like that. Of course, it's difficult to start from hesitation when you have to deal with violence against women. But maybe it could be something. It could be something to take into account ambiguities, hesitation, and so on. And regarding the comments by Andrea Mühlebach, thank you. And well, this idea of the potential of violence, this is something that makes a link with what Andrea Gonzalez told me, the idea of something which is something which is always there somewhere, some way. So it's really complicated to address this issue, because the potentiality is not violence itself. It's something which is always there, and you have to tackle with it. You have to manage it. And sometimes women, they said, we want you to tell everybody that we are not passive. We do a lot, we are active, because all the time, some interviews that of course I didn't report in the book because of privacy, women described very detailed ways to contrast violence, to prevent violence, and doing all the things, and thinking about what to do and what to do next, and on and on. And so I think that this idea of potential violence is very important, because sometimes women, they are not victim of physical domestic violence, but are victim of domestic violence. This sort of potentiality of violence. And yes, the idea, the question of methodology, how to approach such a difficult issue and such a difficult subject. I must admit that at the beginning I was a bit I had some trouble in managing the interview, because, as I told you, it could become something that I couldn't not manage. I could not contain in some way. And at the same time, there was this sort of tentative, this sort of way of find a sort of confidence. So do you understand what I'm saying? No, I'm sure that you understand what I'm saying, even if you did not have a violent partner. And so I was in a sort of embarrassment, because it seemed like that these women, they wanted to be in confidence with me, and at the same time they were I don't know, some way a bit confused by the fact that I was interested in their story, and at the end they didn't want to see me anymore. And so regarding the methodology, it's difficult, because for me it was much easier to go into the court and observe and stay there and understand what's happening. And I was writing very quickly because I couldn't record. And on the other side, the relationship with women, it was not really easy. It was a bit complicated, and sometimes all of a sudden they stopped talking and they went away. And I mean, it's been quite complicated. And yes, the methodology of my research has been well, to take time and to understand a lot after the research, even because I didn't have the time, because the research was an action research, and the various reports were written, and I didn't have time to go back to the interviews and go back to the observations to think about them. And then after a while, I had this chance, the opportunity to write down the book because of the foundation, thanks to the foundation. And so that has been something which I think has been very important for me, that this time between the moment of the research and the moment of the writing. And the last question by Andrea Mühlebach is quite difficult, because of course you asked me to clarify a little bit more this relationship between the differences between common law system and Roman law, civil law system. And the issue of testimony, I've relied on this the work of Antoine Garapon, who is a judge, and a French judge and a philosopher. And Garapon, I think, has focused on this specific issue, the fact that there are two different traditions. And the tradition of Roman law is something that cannot disentangle the subject and the crime. So the two subject and the crime overlap some way, and they must be judged all together. So there's a sort of a tradition that that is different in comparison to the common law. Anyway, I'm not very good in law. I'm not expert in law, and anyway, I think that this insight, which is that could give some way an explication about this issue of this focus on testimony, and this focus on the one who has to speak, and the fact that her true self has to be investigated more and more.
Alessandra?
Yes.
If this is a good stopping point, I'd like to get the questions into the mix, if you don't mind. Can I read a couple of these to you? We have 5, actually. Are you ready? Okay, the first one is from Alan Wade. In many countries, professionals who intervene in cases of violence are virtually untrained in understanding and addressing violence, broadly defined. These include lawyers, judges, educators, therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, child protection workers, and so on. So basically, the whole cast of people who are involved in this issue. What is the status of training for legal professionals in Italy and in other locations covered by your work? Which I guess means, is it better or worse in Italy than elsewhere? If you know. If you don't, are not obligated to.
The situation is in Italy is quite uneven because there is the north, the south, and it's quite complicated. Anyway, in the place I live in Bologna, there are several training courses organized by the institutions, and the women's shelter organizes a lot on this issue. So there's a peculiar situation. But I dare to say that in the south of Italy, for example, there are not financial resources to organize training courses and the like, and so it's quite complicated, and I don't know if it's better or worse in comparison to other countries, but it's not a good situation for sure.
Okay, second question. Thank you, Professor Gribaldo, for your important intervention. How does the narrative of the ideal victim of violence reflect something about the normative gendered subject of the wife, and potentially shifts within marital norms within contemporary Italy? I'm also wondering what kinds of expertise, psychological trauma, gendered violence are valued and collected in the courts, and how you think these forms of knowledge shape how women's narratives are understood and judged. Also a hard one.
Okay, this idea of ideal normative subject is something which is related to this imagery, this settled imagery on gender in Italy. And yes, I've worked on that in different moments of my research, and well, I believe that media play a great role on that, and there's a general way to conceive gender and women through the language of Catholicism. So behind this request to tell the truth, to be sincere, there is always this idea of the Madonna, of the Mother Mary, of the woman who is innocent some way. And so even some time ago, there were moments in which even in feminist movement and demonstration, there was a debate, because sometimes there were this sort of need to distinguish between good and bad women. So the idea that women have to be the subject of care, the subject, the mothers, daughters, and on the other side there were I don't know, women who lend themselves to sex economic exchanges and things like that. So, of course, there's a debate in Italy about this ideal normative regarding gender and women especially. And the expertise needed for to tackle with the problem, of course, I believe that it should be a good idea to let social sciences and anthropology and sociology too add to psychological sciences in these programs which address domestic violence, because I mean, I think that it can give new insights to professionals for sure.
That question, Alessandra, that question was from Noel Mollet-Liston. I didn't say that at the time. There's another question from Alan Wade. It's the first, which I'm going to put in, but I'm going to ask you to hold it because we only have 5 minutes left and we can come back to it at the end. Yes, arguably, virtually all forms of violence entail strategies to suppress the victim's resistance. To what extent did you see legal, judicial efforts to elucidate women's resistance and men's deliberate efforts to suppress that resistance? Okay, that's a big question. So hold that in mind and we'll try to come back to that. This next one is from Rikramaditya Sahai. I would love to hear a little more about the hesitation. Are we saying that hesitation is something produced at the threshold, as the commentators called it, or is there hesitation internal to speech itself? If there are if there are different hesitations, how does one disarticulate them, one from the other? Also, this is deep. All these questions are big and deep. So good luck to you.
Yes, the issue of hesitation is it's important, I think, and it was a sort of anchor for me to understand a bit better and to delve into the issues I was facing at the time of the research, because it seemed to me that it could give me the opportunity to get out from this idea of women as victims, simple victims, but it gave me the possibility to understand strategies, to understand moments of suspension, to understand a little bit better. And is this hesitation just in, something that is sometimes is something that is consciously brought on, or is it something which is internal to speech? I don't know. I think both of them. Internal to speech, yes, some way the language of law and has a chance to be more just when it hesitates. And I think that this way to decide something is important for judges. And sometimes when I talk to judges and magistrates, it is quite clear that this moment in which we have to stop and think about that. And I think it's that's a way to turn the language of law into something else which is not already there, but can be an opportunity to think a little bit more about that and to prepare and made up new instruments to even language to speak about that. I don't know if I answered.
No, it's a great start. We are at the 6:15 mark. I'm going to read the next two questions together and let you answer them both sort of as an ensemble. First is from Marina Braccato. I would like to ask Professor Gribaldo how important a feminist perspective is in working on such a complex issue as domestic violence. And there's a large question about the feminist perspective in relation to this work. And then Anne McKeon asks, the accused has a right to remain silent in adversarial systems, and their guilt must be proven beyond reasonable doubt. This leaves any vulnerable witness exposed to further abuse, as you described. I understand that inquisitorial legal systems give the accused a right to speak. They are obliged to speak, but may provide different ways to disrupt a vulnerable person's testimony. Is there any comparative research on the different types of formal court processes and the effects on the kinds of cases that you're working on, Alessandra? Okay. Feminism in two different kinds of court systems.
Yeah, and okay, the feminist perspective. I think, of course, that feminist perspective is absolutely important, and I've started to work on this issue together with colleagues, criminologists, who and we have had the chance to work with the women's shelter in Bologna, and the women's shelter in Bologna, the Casa delle Donne, is a place where feminism is crucial. It's not an institution like neutral, like the different institution. It's something. It's an institution that declares and claims the fact that feminism is a methodology, is a way to approach domestic violence, and sometimes they are criticized for that, because sometimes they are accused not to be neutral, and they say our methodology is a feminist methodology, and we claim that, and there's a sort of really an intelligence, a feminist intelligence that lies behind all the practices. But I didn't speak about that, wrote about that in the book, and the second question, the obligation to speak, and it's okay. Of course, to speak is very important, as I said before. The single voice has to join this sort of chorus, and to speak means to have the chance to get justice. And at the same time, I'm sure that there are different ways to welcome, different ways to welcome the stories women are ready to narrate, and maybe there are, and some judge has suggested the possibility to listen to the testimony in advance, not to wait 2 or 3 years for the trial to start, but have this sort of moment in which women can be, and public prosecutors can ask the judge to do that, to listen to women at the beginning. But this is normally not accepted because a lot of troubles, because it's time consuming, it's complicated, and so on. But I'm sure there are possibilities and ways to tackle the issue of domestic violence differently in court.
Thank you. That was extremely helpful. Andrea and Andrea, do either of you or both of you have thoughts you'd like to introduce before we stop?
I just wanted to thank everyone for being here. I think this is incredibly important work, and I don't work in this field directly, but I imagine that a lot of the things that you found, Professor Gribaldo, are important, not just theoretically, but actually from a practitioner's perspective. And I think, being able to kind of handle that complexity of a topic is really outstanding. So thank you for having me here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I also want to thank you, Alessandra, for writing this, for all this research, because I feel that there is epistemic violence also being committed against these women, and you are breaking that epistemic violence. And not saying giving voice, because I don't like that expression of giving voice, but acknowledging them, and for them being part of your book and of our lives now, like listening to them through your writing. So thanks for that. And thank you everyone for the discussion.
Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you.
Yes, and I'd like to thank the audience for being here, for asking great questions, and for the three of you for the work that you've done separately on these issues that you've all brought together today. I also would really encourage people who haven't so far to read the book. It gets into the depths and intricacies of these relations as we've been talking about them today. And it also offers some, as folks have already said, modes of pushback and of alternative presentations of the realities that the women have lived through, that actually gave me a bit of hope that we could, if not exactly improve the judicial systems, certainly improve society's understanding of these issues and make it possible to reduce the level of violence that these women's face. So there's an opening in this book that I encourage everyone to experience for themselves. Thank you, everyone. Great questions, and I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible.
And the book is open access. I would like to remind you that the book is open access, so it's downloadable.
Yes, freely available. So please.
Thank you for joining us. For ISRF updates and information about future events, please sign up to our mailing list at www.isrf.org/mailing list. See you again soon. Goodbye.